In this video, we are going to work through an example processing a data file using data modeling and LINQ query techniques. This data file looks like the following data, or has the following data. We have a line of text that starts with a hash mark, and this line of text is telling us to find the average grade for each student. Then what follows looks like a CSV format, where we have a header line that contains the names of a bunch of column data, and then we have the data itself. So we have a student name in the first column, and then it looks like we have 7 exam grades, each of them holding an integer value. So our goal will be to find the average exam grade for each student and display them, and I want to display the results in a sorted order so that the highest average is displayed first, lowest is displayed last. So let's pull up Visual Studio and see if we can make this happen. So I have an empty Windows Form application, and I'm going to add some controls to help me solve this problem. First, I'm going to add a rich text box. The rich text box will serve as my output canvas, so I can output my results to this rich text box. Then I'm going to add 2 buttons here. One button is going to let me process one button is going to let me process the data file, the other button will let me select the data file to process. And then finally, I need an open file dialog. So I'm going to grab an open file dialog, drag it onto my form, and instantiate an open file dialog object. Open file dialog will help me in choosing and selecting the file path to the file I want to process. Now let's customize this form just a little bit. For our button 1, I'm going to rename button 1 to say load file, and I'm going to register an event handler for button 1 named load file. And so when I click on the button 1, we're going to try to find the file in which to process. Our second button I'm going to name process file. And this button I'm going to register a click event handler for as well, and I'm going to name this process file. So I have 2 event handler methods here. And the functionality of this form, the way I think I'm going to make it work, is that I'm going to disable the process file button until a valid file was selected. So the process button should be grayed out until a valid file was selected from the load file event, and then we will enable this button so that we can process that data file. So let's see if we can set up the framework for reading the values from the file, and then I'm going to create a model that will model the data in the file. But first, let's set up our framework. I need to get a file name, a file path value from my open file dialog in my load file event handler into my process file handler. So I need to select the file here, read the file here. So if I'm going to pass a value from one event handler to the next, I need a variable to store that value. So I'm going to make a field variable in my class. So private string file path. This variable will hold the file path long enough so that I can access it in my process method. In my constructor, I'm going to initialize my file path to be an empty string. This is going to help when I set up my protection for my processing the file path. And I'm going to set my button 2's enabled property to be false. I'm disable the process button to begin with. When we go to load the file, so when we click on the load file button, I want to create an open file dialog and grab the file name property from that dialog. So let's do that. The show dialog method from the open file dialog object returns a dialog result data type. So I'm going to make a dialog result variable to hold the result of the open file dialog 1's show dialog method call. This show dialog method will spawn the window, and when the window is closed, either by a good selection or by canceling, some value will be returned to this variable, either dialog result OK or dialog result cancel. Okay, so if dr is equal to a dialog result OK value, this is the condition where the user selected a valid file. So in this case, I'm going to set my file path equal to the open file dialog file name property, and I'm going to enable my button 2. So button 2 enabled is true. So we can now click the process button. If the user does not select a valid file, they cancel it somewhere in between or before they select it, I'm going to set my file path back to an empty string and disable my button 2 again. So the only way the process button can be clicked is if the user selected a valid file name from our open file dialog. Okay, it's time to process the file, so I need a StreamReader class. The StreamReader class exists in the system.io namespace. So added for StreamReader access. So system.io contains the StreamReader and StreamWriter classes. Now it's time for me to open the file, read all the lines of the file, then close the file. So first we will open the file. I'm going to make a StreamReader variable or object is equal to a new StreamReader and open the file path variable. File is open. Now it's time to read each line in the file. So while I have not reached, or while the end of stream property is not true, so while not at end of file, I'm going to create a string variable to hold the current line I'm reading. So I'm going to do a read line, read a line of data from the file, store it in a variable, and then process this line. Then if I haven't reached the end of the file, I'm going to do it again. Read the next line, process it. Have we reached the end? If not, I'm going to read it, process it, and so on until we get to the end. And at the very end, I'm going to close my file connection. All right, I think we've set up a little framework for reading all the data from the file. Now it's time to model our data. So if I go back to my slide here, we see that we have a name value and we have 7 exam grades. So if I try to create a class to model a student, for example, so that student should have a name property and some type of grade collection property. Now I know there are 7 grades here, so I could make an array that will hold 7 integer values, but I'm going to try to use a list. So I think if I get I'm going to make a list that holds integers. So if I have a string name property and a list property in my student class, I think I can properly model and hold all of these values. Now the second thing is we need to eventually calculate an average of each of these grades. So in my data model here where I model a student, I'm going to add a method called getAverage, which will just return the average of the grades of that student object. So we're going to try to make the class do some of the work for us. So let's try to make this happen. Time to add a student class to our project. I'm going to go to Project, add a class, and I'm going to name this class the student class. Add it to our project. Now we need some properties and constructors and methods to do some work here. So I'm going to make a public name property, public string name property, and I'm going to use the auto-implemented property syntax. So this is not protected, it's just unlimited access to the name property. And I'm going to do the same thing for my grades. I'm going to make a public list of integers named grades, and I'm going to allow it to have read and write access. So I have a name variable and a integer list type in my student class. So those are my properties. Let's label these. These are my properties. Now I need a way to build a student, so I'm going to build some constructors here. Constructors. So I'm going to make a public student constructor that takes nothing That's a little default constructor that we won't worry about. But I'm going to create a constructor that takes a string name as an input. So we can initialize this student object by passing in a name. And in this constructor, well, inside my default constructor, I need to instantiate my grades object. List is a class data type. So if I want to build the class, I have to say grades is equal to a new list of type integer. And we will build this parameterized constructor where I say name is equal to the name that's passed in, and my grades is equal to a new list of integers. So these are empty list objects. When I build my student object, it's going to build this empty list, so I can, from my student object, I can add grades to my grades property. And we will see that work in just a moment. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little helper method. It's going to be a public. It will return a double. Let's call it get average. And this method is just going to return the grades list dot average value. So I'm going to use a LINQ method to calculate the average of all grades in the list. All right. So here's our first LINQ method we are using. The average method from our grades list. Okay, let me summarize this up because I don't want this to be confusing. In my data set here, I need to extract a name and multiple grades, multiple integer grades. So I've modeled the data to fit in this class that has a name, a string name value, and a list of grades. Now when I first build a generic student object, I'm either going to build a student without a name assigned to it yet, or I can use this parameterized constructor to pass in a name value to initialize my name property at the beginning. But in both constructors, when I build a new student, they will have no grades added to that student object. I can then add, because grades is a public list, I can add grades into the grades property of my student as I read them from the file. Finally, I have a little helper method here which will return the average grade from the number of grades that have been added to this class. All right, so here's my student. This is my data model that represents the data in my file. Now it's time to process the line. What I need to do is move the values. I need to extract the values from the line of text that I read from the file and build them into some data structure of students. So I'm going to do this in two parts. First of all is when I'm processing the file, I'm going to add a variable. And it's going to be a list of type student. And I'm going to call this the class list. And we're going to build it. Equals a new student list. So this is a list of student objects. Okay. Inside this class list, it's empty right now. I want to extract a line of text from the file. So here we've read a line of text. So here we pull a line or read a line. The next step is going to be pull the values from the line. So pull values from the line and put into a student object. So how can we do that? Well, to split the values on the line, I'm going to use the split method. So I'm going to create a string array named data equals line.split, and I'm going to split on a comma. Okay, so the data array that I extract should have each of these string values as indexed data. So index 0 will be the name, index 1 through 7 will be the grades. Okay. So what I can do here is I could create a string variable named name and say this is data at index 0. Okay, once I have the name extracted, I can build my student object because I built a default or a parameterized constructor that takes a name value in. So now I'm going to create a student. Student s is equal to a new student and pass in the name value. My student s now should have a name property, which I've initialized, and a grades list property, which should be empty. So it's time to fill that list. So to fill the list, I'm going to loop over the remainder of my data array here. So I've split the line. So index 1 till the end of the list will have grade values. So I'm going to build a loop here that says for int I is equal to 1, I is less than data.length, I++. I'm iterating over the remainder split values from my string, from the line I read. And I'm going to say s dot grades, which is a list, dot add. Here I can add an integer. I want to add s at index I. I'm sorry, data at index I. Data at index I is going to be each of those grade values, but it's each of those grade values as a string data type. So I need to do an int.parse around this data. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to, for each string grade in the line of text, parse the string into an int and add it to the grades property of my student class. So we've built the student, we've initialized the name. Here we are pulling all the values from the split line that we just read, popping the grades into our grades list. Now the last step is add this student to my class list. So class list.add my student. And that's the work we are going to do while we are reading the file. So to walk through it, for each line in the file, I'm reading the line, splitting the data into its pieces, building an object from those pieces, adding that initialized object to a list. I'm transferring the contents of the file into this list of student objects. Now there's one thing I forgot to do. If we look at our data set, I have some rogue lines here that I need to ignore because I can't parse these values. That's going to crash my program. So in my processing step, I forgot to ignore the title lines. So I'm going to say if line.starts with a hash symbol or line.starts with the word students, then I'm going to continue. Ignore. We will just break out of the loop, check to see that we're not at the end, read the next line, and continue. And just to check, student is plural, so you need, when you use starts with, if you want it to catch it, you have to make sure your spelling is correct. So spell the method name right and make sure you use the correct starts with value here. All right, I think this is going to be correct. This is going to read each line, ignore the first two title lines, split each line into its pieces, build a student object initialized with the name that we pulled, go through the rest of the data array and put the grades into my grades array of my student, add that student to the list. When we close here, we should have transferred all, from this point, all text file data should exist inside our class list object. Now it's time to do the actual query work. We're going to use a LINQ query to extract the results. So use a LINQ query to find average grades for each student. So we're going to build a LINQ query. If you haven't watched my LINQ query video, you might want to watch that before this part. But we're going to create a var query and set it equal to, the first part is I need to select what type of data is in what collection. So I'm going to say from student in my class list. Class list is the list that contains my objects. Therefore, each object in my class list should be of type student. So if I hover over student here, it's not showing it yet, but it will. So student right here should be a list of students. Okay. Next, after the from statement comes the where syntax. So I'm going to say where, we don't need a where clause, so no where clause needed. I'm not filtering out any of the students. I want the average from every single student. But we do need an order by statement. I want to order by the student.getAverageValue. And I want to order it high to low, so I think I'm going to order it in descending order. Okay, so this line right here is going to, after we look at each student in my collection, I'm going to return the average value for each student, the average grade, and this resulting query's data is going to be sorted according to this average value from high to low. And then finally comes the select statement. It says, what data do I want to pull from this list? Well, I just want to pull the entire student object. So the student here, now it's showing me that this is a student class. Class list is a list of students. Student itself is just a student object. Because it's a student object, I can call the getAverage method from the student class. We're selecting the entire object from this query. Now it's time to display the results. So I'm going to take my rich text box 1, clear any old data, so erase old data, and then print the new data. So for each var item in my query, we are looping over everything that's been put into this query container based on this query syntax. So because my query is selecting student objects, my query should hold student objects. And if I look at this, the type of this query is I ordered enumerable. This is like a generic list type, and it contains data types of type student. So I should be able to, from this query, I should be able to extract the name and average values. So I'm going to say rich text box 1 dot append text, create a string.format method, and first I will output the student name, and then I will output the grade. We'll format it to do 2 decimals, add a new line, insert my item.name and my item.getAverage. Okay, let's look at this code to make sure we feel okay about it. To review, this part, in this step right here, this loop, we are just filling a list of students with student objects that are initialized using data from the file. My query is going to grab all the students in my list. I want to sort by the average value of the grades. And in my query, the data types that I want to put into my result are all of the student objects from this class list. Okay, really this query is all it's doing is sorting the list. All right, then my query is a collection of students, so I'm going to say for each thing in my query, well, those things are type students. So for each student in the results, my sorted results, print that student's name and average value. Let's see if this works. Okay, we're going to try to, I can't process the file because we disabled it. I'm going to load a file, go to my downloads, select the valid file, and now my process button is enabled again. Just to show you, if I go to load a file and cancel out of it, say, never mind, I re-disable my process button. So I can only process a file if I select a valid file. So we will select the valid file, open, process the file, and here are the results. So not only did we calculate the average, but we've sorted the results high to low. This concludes my first example on using LINQ queries and data modeling to process a data file. The next video we will do a more complicated data file.